Hello. So I have 3 stacks of books here, and these are all the books I read in 2024. I think some of these books I actually thought I read like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but my app is telling me I read them in 2024, which is crazy because I do not remember reading them this year. And then there's some books that I read in 2022 and 2023 that I thought I read this year. That's crazy. Anyways, let's start. So the first book is The Gates of Europe. I'm not going to try and pronounce his name, but he has a few books. He also has another book on like the Ukraine conflict, and I think one on Russian foreign policy. This was an okay book. It reads a lot like somebody indexed the events and then just put some paragraphs to each time, like each event in the timeline. It doesn't read like somebody who's like a super big nerd and just goes on like excessive rants into like crazy amounts of detail about a particular topic in history. But it is a decent book to get a general overview of Ukrainian history. That's what this book is, it's the general history of Ukraine. And I think it's meant as a prepper to understand the Crimean conflict, but now obviously it will be useful for understanding the Ukraine war. So that's why I read it. And I think, yeah, it was like a decent book. It's worth reading. The Denial of Death was an okay book. It was, if you've never like studied psychology before, or like you're not used to like philosophy of death, this book might come off as like really cool and interesting to you. But for someone who's been studying this stuff for as long as I have, it was an okay book. Basically, like the idea is that heroism is a way of coping with our fear of death, and that most of our culture is designed as a way to cope with our fear of death, stuff like this. Yeah, just basic like Freudian psychology with like existential philosophy, you could say. It was a decent book. I would read it. The Psychology of Love by Sigmund Freud. I wouldn't read this book. This is just Freud's theories of sex. It's actually very little bit of it is about love. He does talk about love, but it's very, from what I recollect, it's very little. If you have an interest in Freud, you should probably read this book. But other than that, like this book is just good for laughs. Some of the theories in here are way too crazy to even take interesting, and they're not like they're not like his approach to psychology is different in the sense when you compare it to Jung, in the sense that some of his theories don't seem like they integrate together, whereas when you read Jung, it seems like he's building a whole entire system that kind of integrates with one another. But here, it just seems like he's painting his system onto different events. It seems, yeah, it doesn't seem feasible at all. This next book is A Mind for Numbers by Barbara Oakley. I can't believe I read this book this year. Basically, it's just going over like different theories of learning. It shouldn't even be called A Mind for Numbers. What it should really be called is How to Learn. So like, for example, top-down versus bottom-up learning, or what is that thing where they talk about like schematizing it, where like you learn some foundational principles, and then you build on those foundational principles more abstract stuff, and you kind of scale your way up. I think maybe it's called scaling. Or maybe the distributed learning versus like all at once learning, and things like this, right? It's a very basic book. You could read it if you've never studied how to learn, and if you have an interest in that. But for me, this was a very basic book, and I wouldn't recommend it if you're already familiar with like how the cognitive science of education, basically. The Rise of Mutual Funds. This was an interesting book. I think what's great about this book is it gives you an insider's perspective on how audits or regulations shape the mutual fund industry, and what are some of the competitive advantages that the mutual fund industry has in relation to let's say like savings accounts, or investing with an ETF, or there's sometimes, I don't know if this happens anymore, but there's basically a kind of account that you can create at the bank that is a high interest yielding. It's not a savings account. It's like a high interest yielding account. Things like this. Yeah, it just talks about that, and also talks about like why banks didn't want mutual funds to become a thing in the beginning. If you have an interest in mutual funds and you want to know more about them, I'd recommend this book, but you could probably skip this book because it's not going to help you as an investor. It'll probably just help you as someone who wants to understand regulations and how they shape industries. That's basically what this book is going to be about. So next book is The Rule of Saint Benedict. I read this as a kind of self-help guide. I wanted to see like, what is this abbot doing for like living his life? And like maybe the first couple of chapters are like this, where it's like kind of useful principles you could abstract to your life. But then the rest of the book is actually just about how abbots should be conducting themselves. And that is not at all applicable to self-help for the most part. Yeah, like how to punish students, or how to practice prayer, or stuff like this, right? I wouldn't recommend this book unless you're interested in like monasticism, then maybe, but this book wasn't that good in my opinion. Confessions, I didn't even realize I read this year. I actually forgot that I even read this book. That's crazy. Thank God there's apps. Confessions by St. Augustine. This was a fun book. Honestly, he writes really well. It wouldn't be a good book if he was a bad writer. I'll say that, because like it's just an autobiography basically, and he's not that like analytical or like deeply reflective in the way that like Jung is in like the Red Books, for example. But he's a really good writer, and that makes it actually entertaining to read. And so for that reason, I would recommend reading this book. This is one of those very popular books that is surprisingly quite decent. Yeah. Ghost Wars, The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and Bin Laden. This, I could say, if you have an interest in Afghanistan, read. If you don't have an interest in Afghanistan, don't read this book. There are better books out there. There's a lot of interesting like insights, and I think he does a fair job of painting the relationships between America and Pakistan, and America and Afghanistan, and even America and Russia. I think he was fairly objective. There wasn't too much like bias that I could sense. Of course, he does use like testimony a lot to support some of his claims, but that's unavoidable with the nature of these books. So do with that what you will. But I would say you could skip this book. It's not a bad book. It's not a book that's gonna give you a lot. I felt like I didn't walk away with a lot from this book, just me personally. And so if you want to be like a well-rounded person, there's probably better books than that book to read. Afghanistan by Jonathan Lee. I remember reading this book. This book is fantastic. I think everybody should read this book, even if you don't have an interest in Afghan history. This is just a fantastic history book. The amount of detail in here is terrific, and the amount of analysis. It's not just like for example, he talks about military blunders quite a lot when there was conflicts, even when the opponents were under-equipped and under reinforced, like they didn't have enough troops, they could still win because like British generals were just making terrible mistakes. On top of that, the analysis of like the court policies between Afghanistan, Russia, and Britain, that was very interesting. Or even the Afghanistan is very much like a Game of Thrones history, where the courts, like the rival families, were filled with betrayal and espionage, and there was a lot of like 4D chess being played in Afghan history, you could say. And for that, like he does a great job of analyzing all that. The book is very long, so I highly recommend this book. Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. This is a very popular book. I didn't like it as much. I feel like it's overhyped. I feel like it's overhyped, and I feel like the title is misleading. The content of the book is more about like the morality and politics of debt, which is something that should be discussed with the nature of debt. However, that's the whole book, to be honest. The whole book is actually the morality and politics of debt. And some of the interesting parts are too short, like when he talks about the origins of markets. I would have preferred a lot more, of an, maybe he could have made this book 1,000 pages, right? And put more analysis about like how debt shapes economies and things like that as well, not just like the anthropology of debt. I felt like the book the title's too wide. And if he would have shrunk the book, because he repeats himself a lot, and just called it the morality or like the anthropology of debt, I probably would have gave it like a better rating. But there's a lot of repetition in this book as well. So, I mean, you can read it if you want, but like I don't recommend it too highly. Daniel C. Dennett, Freedom Evolves. This is a fantastic book, actually. This might be his best book on the topic of free will. Not only because of the claim that freedom evolves, and that like it seems to be the case that there's something in biology that grants us this sense of free will, at least that the kind of free will that's worth wanting. which is an interesting idea, but also he does a great job of pointing out the presuppositions of the opposite camps. So, for example, a lot of determinists think that inevitability is synonymous with determinism, but he makes this great analogy to Conway's Game of Life, for example, where he says, you could have rules, like in the Conway's Game of Life, but those rules could reach like let's say 10 to the 100 states, like 10 to the 100 possible combinations. But the odds of reaching all of those states are so low that it's not likely they're ever going to be reached. And just a low probability of reaching some of those states. So what he's arguing here is that deterministic rules don't equal inevitable outcomes. It actually is probably more accurate to say that there's probabilistic outcomes that are a result of deterministic rules, but those outcomes aren't guaranteed. And I thought that was a really interesting way of phrasing determinism. Dennett's really, really clever when it comes to this topic. Surprisingly so, because, like when he talks, he doesn't strike you as someone with like high cognitive fluidity, but clearly in his writings, he's quite sharp, especially on topics he's educated about. So I would definitely recommend reading this book. George Bataille, I don't know if I said this, Bataille, I don't know if I said it right, but this is a fun book. I like this book. It's a bit of an R-rated book, but he talks a lot about sex, death, and the relationship between cultures, sex, and death. I believe he even talks about the metaphysics of sex and how it's related to the catharsis of death. And he says his favorite. There's some one-liners in here that are pretty you're gonna remember them. He talks about how his favorite place to pray is a brothels in France. It's one of these books. I will say it is a bit abstract in the writing. He talks about prostitution. Yeah, it's a bit abstract, and the way he writes, it's typical existentialist / left-leaning writers tend to write this really abstract way. But there is a lot of interesting ideas in here that I don't even agree with most of them because they're just too loose, they're too weird, but they're really fun. They're really enjoyable, and I think they're worth reading for that reason. The Greatest Trade Ever. There goes some dust. This is an okay book. If you just want a book that's going to get you in the finance headspace, you can read this book, but this book isn't filled with too much technical detail. There's very little math in here. Actually, there's no math in here. If you want to read a book that's just you're maybe looking to get yourself in the finance headspace, and you're maybe you're me and you spend 5 hours reading or studying a financial report, and you've just been crunching numbers, and maybe you want to pick up a book that is about finance but isn't heavy in numbers, so you can kind of let your unconscious bake up some ideas. It's a solid 7 or 6 out of 10. Freedom Evolves by Eric Fromm. No, sorry, Fear of Freedom by Eric Fromm. This was an interesting book. I believe I reviewed this book. It's not as good as it is popular. It's a bit of a popular book, but it's not as good as it is popular. And some of the reasons I think are because the ideas are really basic. I think also this book heavily overlaps with the denial of death. I believe he believes that we're afraid of death. And so here he's talking about we're confronted with choices and actions that we don't know. And whereas I think the guy who wrote Denial of Death would say we're afraid of death and so we go to heroism. He would say we're afraid of choices and so we resort to conformity or something like this. I guess at the time this might have been a really original work or a unique work, but since so many authors have come after him talking about similar topics, it's okay. I'll give it a 7. I don't think you have to read this, but if you're not familiar with psychology at all, or sociology or philosophy, you could probably read this and walk away with some useful insights. Charles Darwin. This was a great book. I actually like this writer's writing style. People have critiqued this writer a lot. There's some controversy around him, but from what I found inside this book, it's not too bad. He does a great job of pointing out, repetitively so, that other authors have published very similar ideas to Charles Darwin, not just other biologists, but geologists and Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's grandfather, have very similar ideas In fact, I bought a book called The Principles of Geology that Darwin brought on the boat, the Beagle, I think it's called, that he read excessively. And in that book, there is basically the same idea of natural selection inside that book. People accused him also of not understanding, like the author, not understanding evolution. But as far as I can tell, his understanding of evolution is perfectly in line with adaptationism. He's not even a sociobiologist, he's an adaptationist. I think where people had a knee-jerk reaction is he critiques how some people use evolutionary theory. And that's maybe where the knee-jerk reaction happened. But I don't recall him unreasonably critiquing. Like, I think this is a topic where reasonable people can disagree. Yeah, I mean, I would recommend it, but you can check the Goodreads reviews. The Oxford Handbook of Freedom. This was a pretty interesting book for somebody who wouldn't know much about this topic. If you're like excessively educated in philosophy, you're already going to know most of the topics in here. Like, for example, there's this notion of like economic value versus freedom. Are those mutually exclusive, right? So can making somebody wealthier actually result in them having less freedom? Or the inverse is having more freedom results in less wealth? Does freedom clash with other values? So for example, does the mitigation of harm clash with freedom? There's always this idea of like, if I restrict your ability to move inside society, I am to some extent restricting your freedom, but I'm also mitigating your risk for harm because I'm not letting you go into areas where you shouldn't be. Stuff like this, right? These kinds of conversations. A lot of stuff talked about, Adam Smith. There's a few chapters in here about Adam Smith and his notion of freedom and enlightenment. Yeah, I would say overall, this was a decent read. I would probably say it's like an 8 or a 7. And it's not a must-read, though. Like, the only book so far that is a must-read, I think, is the Afghanistan history book. It's not a must-read, but it is a good read. Human Society and Ethics and Politics by Bertrand Russell. I don't think you should read this book. If you know nothing about philosophy, then go ahead and read this book. But this book is basically like, let's take moral realism and apply it to society and politics, and then argue that if we don't adopt moral realism, that society will go in the wrong direction. That's my TLDR of this book. I did a more thorough review of it, but yeah, that's what this book is, okay? The Warren Buffett Portfolio. Okay, actually now there's 2 books so far that you must read. I think you must read this one. This is a fantastic book. What's great about this book is it talks about this idea of focus investing versus modern portfolio theory, which is diversified investing, but also I think modern portfolio theory uses things like the weighted average cost of capital, where this book encourages you to use discounted cash flows. This was a big game changer for me because I had a diversified portfolio of I think like 40 or 60 stocks. Now 40% of my portfolio is in one stock, and I have I think 22 other stocks, and I'm going to shrink that down to 15. Yeah, and my portfolio has been performing slightly better than it was historically, actually. So it's been going great for me. And the idea here is that actually, by the way, you're supposed to pick one gem of a company that will outcompete the market. And the way you pick one gem of a company is by saying no to 200 companies. Like, he's not saying just pick one randomly and load up on it. He's saying analyze 200, and out of those 200, pick the one that's the best and put most of your money, like bet on that. That's what he's arguing. So this I think is a must read because it goes against at least what I've been exposed to through modern portfolio theory, which is diversification, not only in terms of sectors and number of companies, but also I've even seen diversification in terms of geography. So ISIS, the State of Terror. To be honest, this book was, I have mixed opinions. I wish this book was like this other book I'm going to show you, but this is like basically how ISIS did their media campaigns online. That's like the biggest takeaway from this book. It does, like in the first 25% of the book, go over the doctrines of ISIS and some of the infighting that has happened and what their goals and ambitions are. But then after that, everything else is how ISIS has communicated with the external world, pretty much, whether it's through Twitter, YouTube, or forums, which is fine because the professor who wrote this book is a communications professor, but I was hoping for a more general book. I think you can skip this book entirely, especially if you have no interest in this topic. The Return of a King. This was a fantastic book. This is about Afghanistan. I've said before, it's like a general history. It doesn't go over the complete general history, but like the first quarter of the book, maybe 1/3 of the book, is general Afghan history, going from like the Durrani Empire and talking about the Sadozai and what is the other one? The two rival families in Afghanistan. And that kind of sets the groundwork for the relationships between the spies that showed up to Afghanistan, like the Russian and British spies, which then sets the ground for the first Anglo-Afghan War. And then you kind of get some of the fallout of the first Anglo-Afghan War. And the epilogue, I believe, talks about modern-day Afghanistan. So it's like it's long enough to be a general history book, but it doesn't go into too much of the second Anglo-Afghan War, I believe. That's from what I remember. I don't think it does. But yeah, this is a good book. I don't know if it's a must-read, but it's definitely a good book. Farewell, Kabul. This was a fantastic book. I really enjoyed she does a great job of not only participating in the conflicts and explaining how what was unfolding when she was there on the ground, but also giving us a background information that's really important to understand what she witnessed, right? So she did a great job of always presenting background information that could let us understand what she was witnessing on the ground. And she has like 30 years of experience. That's why this book is so long. And I loved that it was this exhaustive. I didn't think it was going to be this good, but it was pretty good. I would definitely give it like an 8 out of 10. And if you're interested in Afghan history, I think this is worth a read, because also she critiques a lot of the policies of different governments involved, not only in Pakistan, but in Afghanistan as well. So this book, Al-Qaeda, Jason Burke. This is a fantastic book, and I think this is a must-read if you're interested in radical Islam. This guy goes through all the primary sources of all the writers that the radicals would follow, and you could tell he's read them, and he cites them word for word, explaining what their worldview is. He's using their words to depict their worldview, as opposed to using media sources to depict their worldview, or using their behaviors to depict their worldview, which a lot of people actually tend to do. People look at behaviors trying to depict someone's worldview, but he's using the sources that inspire their actions. And that gives you a really, really good understanding. And it also, quite frankly, disagrees with how Western governments have dealt with this issue. Because this isn't just like a resource war he's arguing. It is fundamentally like a religious issue. And it's not just his opinion. He's citing the writers who are claiming it is a religious issue. Making Globalization Work by Joseph Stiglitz. This was a pretty good book. Stiglitz repeats himself a lot in many of his books, but this book focuses mostly, I think, on the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and U.S. foreign policy, or at least economic foreign policy. And it talks about how the U.S. uses these bigger organizations, these global organizations, in very subtle ways that result in bullying or like inefficient globalization. Basically, he thinks there's inefficiencies in globalizations because the United States and other Western nations have co-opted these international organizations for their own benefit. That's like the gist of this book. And he gives like policy suggestions on how to fix that. And this last book, Client-Centered Therapy by Carol Rogers, was a fantastic book. I think this book isn't a must-read, but if you're in therapy, if you're into therapy, you should definitely read this book. It's a must-read only if you're into that topic. This was the first time I was ever exposed to the idea of directive therapy versus non-directive therapy. The idea of being in directive therapy, you kind of guide people, you tell them what you think the issue is. Whereas in non-directive therapy, you listen to people tell you their problem. And then you kind of repeat that you understand, then you ask them, what can they do to fix that problem? On the one hand, with directive therapy, you run the risk of developing a dependency, where with non-directive therapy, you're kind of strengthening the individual. Of course, the other risk might be is that the person in non-directive therapy might not be strong enough to solve their own problems. And whereas in directive therapy, you might be able to actually push them, give them that little push to solve their own problems. There's pros and cons, but he argues that non-directive is better. And he has studies to show that. But I think the biggest takeaway from this is that non-directive therapy can be a tool in your toolbox when you're talking to people about their issues. So this is another fantastic book. So those are all the books I read in 2024. I think it was 24 books. I thought I read 27. I guess I didn't read 27. Or Or maybe there's one book that I'm missing. I don't know. Yeah, those are the books I read in 2024. If you have any books you want me to read in 2025, let me know. I'm going to try and read 30 this year, but we'll see how that goes. And with that being said, bye-bye.